In the year 1347, a ship pulled into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. Its crew was sick. Many were already dead. From its hold crawled rats, carrying fleas, carrying a bacteria that would do what no army, no conqueror, no emperor had ever managed. Within 4 years, the Black Death killed between a third and a half of everyone in Europe, perhaps 50 million people. In some cities, entire neighborhoods were emptied. The dead were buried in mass pits because there was no one left to dig proper graves. And then, the strangest thing happened. The survivors became rich. This is the story of how the worst catastrophe in European history made the continent, paradoxically, the richest it had ever been. How a plague that destroyed a third of the population built the foundations of modern capitalism. This is Empires and Economics. To understand what followed, you first have to grasp the scale of what was lost. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and moved with terrifying speed. By 1348, it had crossed Italy and France. By 1349, it reached England. By 1350, it had consumed northern Europe and swept into Russia. Everywhere it went, it killed with a ferocity modern readers can barely imagine. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through it, described people falling dead in the streets, animals wandering masterless, and the living so terrified they abandoned the sick and fled the cities. He wrote that the healthy avoided the afflicted as though they feared to be poisoned by their very sight. The death toll is genuinely hard to comprehend. Modern demographers estimate that across Europe, between 30 and 50% of the population died. In England, the population fell from roughly 6 million to about 3 million within a few years. Some villages were abandoned entirely, never to be repopulated. The economic logic of the Middle Ages was built on one thing, land, and land was worth only what the labor working on it could produce. A society that suddenly lost a third of its workers no longer had a shortage of land. It had a shortage of people, and that reversal of scarcity would upend everything. Here is the simplest economic fact of the 14th century. When the plague killed so many laborers, the laborers who survived became suddenly enormously more valuable. For centuries, Europe had suffered from too many workers and too little work. Peasants were plentiful, land was scarce, and wages were set low. The Black Death reversed that equation overnight. Now there were too few workers for too much land, and the workers knew it. The result was a wage boom unlike anything Europe had seen. In England, real wages, what a worker could actually buy with his pay, roughly doubled by the end of the century. Laborers who had lived at subsistence suddenly commanded prices their grandfathers could not have dreamed of. Some scholars estimate wages rose by as much as 50% within a single generation in many regions. This was a social revolution playing out in daily life. Peasants left one lord's land and walked to another to demand better terms. Landowners competed openly for workers, poaching tenants from their neighbors. Chroniclers of the age complained bitterly about laborers who became so rebellious and obstinate that they refused to work for the old wages and demanded far more. The old order was built on the assumption that labor was cheap, replaceable, and powerless. The plague had made labor scarce, precious, and suddenly very powerful. And the powers that be were not going to take this sitting down. The elites reacted exactly as you might expect. They passed laws to force wages back down. In 1349, King Edward III of England issued the Ordinance of Labourers, and 2 years later the Statute of Labourers. These laws made it a crime for a laborer to demand more than the wages paid before the plague. Every able-bodied person under 60 with no land was compelled to work for any employer who asked at the old rates. Refusing to work or demanding more could land you in the stocks. Similar laws were passed across the continent. The goal was simple: to use the state's power to freeze the wage rise and protect the landowner's profits. But here's what the lawmakers failed to understand. You cannot legislate away a fundamental change in supply and demand. When workers are scarce, they will always negotiate from strength, no matter what the law says. Enforcement was patchy. Peasants moved, hid, and bargained. Even where the law was applied, it could not create workers who did not exist. Wages kept rising despite the statutes. Landowners, desperate for labor that would stay, began to offer better conditions on their own. Softer rents, more freedom, smaller obligations. The law tried to hold back a tide, and the tide rose anyway. The deepest structural change came in the countryside, where the institution that had defined medieval life for half a millennium began to crumble: serfdom. Serfdom bound peasants to the land and to their lords. They worked the lord's fields, paid him dues, and could not leave without permission. For centuries it had been the bedrock of the rural economy. The plague made serfdom economically irrational. When laborers were scarce, a serf who could not leave was barely worth more than one who could, but a free laborer who chose to work for you, on your terms, was worth a great deal. Lords began to see the old rigid system as a liability. Many freed their serfs and paid wages instead, or relaxed the ties that bound them because it was cheaper and more effective. The trend was uneven and took centuries, but the direction was unmistakable. By 1400, the old model was breaking across much of Western Europe. The plague had not just killed people, it had killed the economic logic of one of history's most oppressive institutions. The historian Michael Poston called this the release of the peasantry, and out of that release came something new, a class of people who worked for wages, moved where labor was needed, and spent the money they earned. The plague's most powerful economic effect was what modern historians call the Great Leveling, a massive redistribution of wealth from the top to the bottom of society. Here is the mechanism. The stock of wealth, land, buildings, goods, gold, did not burn in the plague. It stayed exactly where it was, but the population that had to share it fell by a third, so the amount of capital per surviving person rose dramatically. This was catastrophic for the very rich, whose incomes depended on cheap labor, and liberating for everyone else. Ordinary workers suddenly had disposable income for the first time. They bought better food, better clothing, better tools. They could afford houses and goods that had once been beyond reach. Historians using tax records have mapped this shift with remarkable precision. In England, the share of national wealth held by the richest 1% fell sharply after the plague, while the share held by ordinary households rose. It was one of the most dramatic egalitarian shifts in recorded history. The sociologist and historian Walter Scheidel, in his book The Great Leveler, argues that throughout history only the most violent shocks, plague, war, revolution, have significantly leveled inequality. The Black Death stands as one of his clearest examples. It was a catastrophe that, in purely economic terms, lifted the poor and depleted the rich. With higher wages came demand, and demand is the engine of markets. For the first time, a broad mass of ordinary people had money to spend on things beyond bare survival. They wanted cloth, tools, pottery, candles, furniture, and food that was more than gruel. That surge in consumer demand reshaped the economy. Craftsmen and merchants flourished, towns grew, trade networks expanded. The demographic collapse paradoxically intensified commerce, because the scarce survivors were better paid and spent more per person. This was the seedbed of modern capitalism. The medieval economy had been organized around producing enough food for a static population. Now it was organized around producing goods for people with purchasing power. That is a fundamentally different and more dynamic engine. Economists sometimes say the Black Death accelerated the transition from a feudal economy to a market economy by centuries. The tight bond between lord and serf, the subsistence farm, the local self-sufficiency, all of it loosened. In their place came wage labor, mobility, specialization, and trade. Some historians argue this is precisely what set Europe on the path that would eventually produce the Industrial Revolution. Not immediately, and not alone, but the plague cracked the old system open. A society of free, mobile, better-paid workers and entrepreneurs was a society prepared for the modern age. It is worth pausing to remember that the plague did not just hit Europe, it struck the Middle East, North Africa, and Byzantium too. Yet the outcomes differed sharply. Where Europe had a fragmented patchwork of states competing for scarce labor, some regions of the Middle East had stronger centralized institutions that weathered the shock differently, often reimposing control rather than loosening it. The result was that Western Europe, with its competing kingdoms and lords all bidding against each other for workers, experienced the most dramatic economic liberation. The plague was a lottery, and its economic prizes did not fall evenly. Europe's very political fragmentation, which had once seemed a weakness, turned out to be an advantage in a world of suddenly scarce labor. No single authority could hold wages down forever, because there was always another lord, another kingdom, willing to pay more. So what does the Black Death leave us? It is not merely a story of death, though it is that on a scale we can barely fathom. It is a story about what happens when the balance between people and resources is violently reset. The plague taught Europe that labor is wealth, that when workers are scarce they gain power, that wages, mobility, and freedom are products of that scarcity, and that they in turn create demand, trade, and growth. The Black Death killed perhaps half of Europe, and yet the world that rose from its mass graves was richer, freer, and more dynamic than the one it replaced. Serfdom loosened, wages doubled, wealth spread, and the first stirrings of modern economy were born. It is one of history's great paradoxes and a reminder of a hard economic truth. Sometimes the deepest changes come not from victories, but from upheavals that destroy the old order and force the new one into existence. The priest said the plague was an act of God. The economists might say it was a brutal rebalancing. Either way, when the last victims were buried, Europe did not rebuild the old world. It built a new one, richer, stranger, and more modern than anything that had come before. The plague made Europe rich, not by design, not by will, but by the relentless logic of scarcity and demand. And that logic, once released, has never been put back in the box.